The state is the ultimate arbiter in every case of conflict that arises, including conflicts involving the state itself. Now, if you hear this type of definition, you immediately realize that this is a very unique type of institution. Just imagine that you get together with some friends and suggest that as a solution of social problems, in every case of conflict that I have with you, I will be the ultimate judge who is right and wrong, including also in cases of conflict that I start with you. This is why all states are interested in taxation. We all know that if we have a conflict with the state that the state has actually caused, it is agents of the state that then decide whether they were right in hitting you on the head or they were not right, and you can predict, of course, what their decision by and large will be. Taxation. If such an institution exists, and it does exist, then the consequence will be continuous expropriation and exploitation of property owners. So there is an alternative source of income to the state besides taxes, and that is trying to gain control over the production of money itself. This is why all states are interested in taxation. We all know that if we have a conflict with the state that the state has actually caused, it is agents of the state that then decide whether they were right in hitting you on the head or they were not right, and you can predict, of course, what their decision by and large will be.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the No Way Jose podcast. Today is part 23 of a live reading of Democracy, the God That Failed, coming to the end of this latest chapter, getting ready to go into the last one, where we'll only have a few more left. But with that, let's go ahead and get Toad in here and get into it. What is up, my friend? Not much introduction necessary, being as we are almost 24 parts deep into a very niche book, so I don't think we need much small talk anymore, my friend.
I think somebody might just jump into this particular episode and only watch this one. I don't know.
I think we're far past foreplay. We're just hardcore going at it right now. There's no segues, no preambles, nothing. Just right into the dirty action on page 256 from Democracy, the God That Failed, on Government and the Private Production of Defense, Part 7. That is where we're at. I don't know if you have any thoughts, anything. Maybe you do want to give out some small talk. I know I guess we've kind of been making this a little bit of a time capsule show. We're still dealing with Epstein stuff. They're still murdering people over in Gaza.
Nothing
they're trying
to distract us. I mean, we have, Sydney Sweeney having really good genes, and, which does, that has its own cultural thing. I mean, I don't think that should be ignored completely.
No.
Because, the way the left reacts, you got to watch what's going on there and make sure that you understand. You got to take in everything at once. You need to appreciate
the finer things in life, like boobies.
Yeah, you got to, definitely look at her boobs, Make sure you fully take that in. And then we have, dude, I don't even know what's going on. There was a shooting today, another one. It was a mass shooting committed by a black man this time.
Yeah, it was Cornelius, Quorn, I think Elius. Quite the name. He was a sergeant in the Army. Yeah, I forget. I think it was in Georgia or something. I forget. It was happening during the morning show today. I guess 5 people were shot, but the latest I heard is no one was killed.
Correct, yeah. He sucked at shooting, apparently.
Yeah, well, hey.
That's why he was in the Army.
Yeah, so I guess they're kind of like stormtroopers. But with that, I guess let's go ahead and get into it, buddy.
But black, yeah.
Yeah, black stormtroopers. Or the elite guard or whatever. All right. Yeah. Let's go ahead and get into it. The analogy typically drawn between insurance against natural disasters and external aggression is fundamentally flawed. As aggression is never indiscriminate but selective and targeted, so is defense. Everyone has different locations and things to defend, and no one's security risk is the same as anyone else's. Yet the analogy contains a kernel of truth. However, any similarity between natural disasters and external aggression is due not to the nature of aggression and defense, but to the rather specific nature of state aggression and defense, interstate warfare. As explained above, a state is an agency that exercises a compulsory territorial monopoly of protection and the power to tax, and any such agency will be comparatively more aggressive because it can externalize the cost of such behavior onto its subjects. However, the existence of a state does not just increase the frequency of aggression, it changes its entire character. The existence of states, and especially of democratic states, implies that aggression and defense, war, will tend to be transformed into total, undiscriminating war.
Right. So what we were talking about in the previous section, he's kind of, he's continuing to talk about that. He was talking about how in a private defense scenario, likely insurance companies would be involved because the insurance companies, their incentives kind of line up where, well, if they're going to insure you against property damage or whatever, they obviously would have an incentive to not have to pay that out. So they would actually have the incentive to help you protect your property. So everything would kind of align that way. But he's, of course, making the point here that if the state is providing that protection, the state being an inherent aggressor, they would have opposite incentives, basically, and they would have the incentive to essentially not protect you because they want to, they want it to cost you more. They want to justify like their existence. They want to justify getting more and more tax money. So they're basically going to at least
they want the least amount of income with the least amount of the most amount of income with the least amount of expenditures. Right.
They're essentially going to at least like scare you into thinking that you're like constantly not protected, basically. And that's why he's saying that one of the easiest ways to do that is what they do with the perpetual warfare state there, which of course that's an evergreen statement. We keep seeing that now. You know, there's always some terrorist threat. You know, it's Hamas, Iran, whatever. So we have to continue funding these wars, you know, we're working with Israel and whatever, all that bullshit.
Mm-hmm. You know. Well, that's a good example, bringing up Israel and kind of the concept of world wars, I guess, or even the idea of being dragged to larger territorial wars. It's kind of the idea of, and this is what he's driving at, I think, in this paragraph, is the concept of how states, by their very nature, particularly democratic states, tend to create the incentive when it comes to war of all versus all, as opposed to maybe of old or, say, a non-state entity where it would be, if when you do have war, it's contained amongst the actors who are actually genuinely involved. Whereas when you create a democratic state, and the concept being we all have a stake in this, well, the war of America versus, I don't know, some South American country now becomes the concern of Joe Sixpack. And it becomes a war of all versus all. It also then causes, which I'll sure you go into, the concept of collectivizing states and how, hell, we're literally in the midst of a genocide where they are just slaughtering Palestinians. And so this idea of how this happens. But let's go on. Consider for a moment a completely stateless world. While most property owners would be individually insured by large, often multinational insurance companies endowed with huge capital reserves as bad risks, most, if not all, aggressors would be without any insurance whatever. In this situation, every aggressor or group of aggressors would want to limit their targets, preferably to uninsured property, and avoid all collateral damage. as they would otherwise find themselves confronted with one or more economically powerful professional defense agencies. Likewise, all defensive violence would be highly selective and targeted. All aggressors would be specific individuals or groups located at specific places and equipped with specific resources. In response to attacks on their clients, insurance agencies would specifically target these locations and resources for retaliation, and they would avoid any collateral damage as they would otherwise become entangled with and liable to other insurers. And so now they're just kind of making the point how in a private system they're incentivized to keep this as small of a problem as possible as opposed to as large, because ironically in the state thing and the idea of maximizing income, reducing expenditure, well, what's the greatest scenario for that? Well, fucking war. Oh, you mean the opportunity to increase my income exponentially and probably likely create, put out roughly the same amount of expenditures? Hey, sign them up. They're all for it. So
yeah, I mean, yeah. Here he's saying basically that, this private, insurance protection setup would be more individualized because every individual has their own property they would want to protect, and they'd probably be using these agencies. And he is also saying that if somebody was like a known aggressor or property damager, those are the slurs we're using now, they would be unlikely to be able to get insurance anymore if it was known that they do that. So he's making that point again where they would kind of get like excluded from that. You know what I mean? It's freedom of disassociation would solve that problem. And then he is saying that typically the property that would wind up still being targeted more often than not would be property that isn't insured or protected because there's no recourse there. And usually that's going to wind up being, property that is, owned by like an aggressor basically. So it's like, sorry, you don't have insurance anymore. So then it's kind of like, it's this whole like separate tier, I guess, where you have basically like,
yeah, people are uninsured, do their own actions.
Yeah, like a criminal class, essentially. Just, violating each other's property and whatever. And it's like, well, at that point, we don't fucking care, basically. And if they do happen to aggress against somebody that is insured by one of these actual, defense agencies or whatever, they would have to deal with that defense agency. And I don't think he's necessarily saying that defense agency is going to be like, oh, you aggressed against this person, we're going to go bomb your home or something like that. It's probably not like that. It's probably going to be more of a, they're going to attack you financially, basically, in that respect, obviously, right? I mean, they're going to try to recoup their clients' losses financially, I should say, because it wouldn't be an attack. It would be part of the defense in that case, if that makes sense.
Yep. All of this changes fundamentally in a status world with interstate warfare. If one state, the U.S., attacks another, for instance, Iraq, this is not just an attack by a limited number of people equipped with limited resources and located at a clearly identifiable place. Rather, it is an attack by all Americans and with all of their resources. Every American supposedly pays taxes to the U.S. government is thus de facto, whether he wishes to be or not, implicated in every government aggression. Hence, while it is obviously true, it's obviously false, I meant to say, to claim that every American faces an equal risk of being attacked by Iraq, low or non-existent as such a risk is certainly higher in New York City than in Wichita, Kansas, for instance. Every American is rendered equal with respect to his own active, if not always voluntary participation in each of his government's aggressions. So just making the point that to some extent, because your money is being used, you are to some degree implicated in some sort of sense.
Yeah. I think he wrote this book, during like Iraq War 1 or whatever, because it was before, or was that, I forget which one is 1 and which one is 2, but it was before 9/11 happened, so it was 1, I guess. It was kind of, the 90s shit, the Kuwait shit, the Gulf War, whatever, Desert Storm. I don't know that much about it, but all that shit. So he's just using that as an example because it was current at the time. And of course, the main point in that whole paragraph is basically what you already said, where when you have a democratic state, it completely blurs the line between who is the state, like who is the ruling class and who are the ruled, basically. It's because, it's the government of the people now. It's all of us. That means if there's a war between two states, then de facto, basically, that war becomes a war of the state's people and not just the states, whereas he's made the point throughout this book that in the monarchy system, it wasn't really like that. It was way more clear that this is a war between these two ruling classes, these two states, and the people were a lot less likely to wind up being dragged into that war and less involved. So that was one of the benefits of the monarchy over the democracy.
Mm-hmm. All right. Second, just as the attacker is a state, so is the attacked, Iraq. As is its U.S. counterpart, the Iraqi government has the power to tax its population or draft it into its armed forces. As taxpayer or draftee, every Iraqi is implicated in his government's defense just as every American is drawn to the U.S. government's attack. Thus, the war becomes a war of all Americans against all Iraqis, i.e. total war. The strategy of both the attacker and the defender state will be changed accordingly. While the attacker still must be selective regarding the targets of his attack, if for no other reason than that even taxing agencies, states, are ultimately constrained by scarcity, the aggressor has little or no incentive to avoid or minimize collateral damage. To the contrary, since the entire population and national wealth is involved in the defensive effort, collateral damage, whether of lives or property, is even desirable. No clear distinction between combatants and non-combatants exists. Everyone is an enemy, and all property provides support for the attacked government. Hence, everyone and everything becomes fair game. Likewise, the defender state will be little concerned against collateral damage resulting from its own retaliation against the attacker. Every citizen of the attacker state and all of their property is a foe and enemy property, and thus becomes a possible target of retaliation. Moreover, every state, in accordance with its character of interstate war, will develop and employ more weapons of mass destruction, such as atomic bombs, rather than long-range precision weapons, such as one might imagine, laser gun. Thus, the similarity between war and natural catastrophes, their seemingly indiscriminate destruction and devastation, is exclusively a feature of a statist world.
Yeah. So again, he's talking about how the ordinary citizenry basically get dragged into the states' wars when the states are at war, and democratic states more so than the monarchies and whatever. And yeah, I mean, he's also making the point that people's individual property is probably going to get damaged to some extent in this war, and that the government might actually even want that. Like, at the very least, they don't give a shit at all, but they might even want that, because then it just kind of almost like it supports their case even more, almost, where it's like, well, your property got damaged in this war that we must be fighting, so you need to give us more money because we have to fight this war, and because of this war, your property got damaged, so we need more of this. You know what I mean? I think an example of that was actually the COVID shit, right? Because it was basically like the government was like, we need to shut down all your businesses forcibly because of this fucking virus. It's a war on this virus, right? And it wasn't us that did that. It wasn't us, the government. It was the virus that did it. This had to happen. And then what did they do? That justified them taking more of your tax money. Now we need this huge relief bill. So let's get, one of the biggest bills in history. I think the second biggest now, to the big, beautiful bill. You know what I'm saying, right? Because it justified, just taking more and more of your money. So not only did they just crush all your businesses, but now they're crushing you even further by stealing more of your money. And it just goes on and on like that.
100%. All right, it's on to you, buddy. It's your turn.
All right, Section 8. This brings on the last problem. We have seen that just as all property is private, so is and must all defense be insured individually by capitalized insurance agencies, very much like industrial accident insurance. We have also seen that both forms of insurance differ in one fundamental respect. In the case of defense insurance, the location of the insured property matters. The premium per insured value will be different at different locations. Furthermore, aggressors can move around, their arsenal of weapons may change, and the entire character of aggression can alter with the presence of states. Thus, even given an initial property location, the price per insured value can alter with changes in the social environment or surroundings of this location. How would a system of competitive insurance agencies respond to this challenge? In particular, how would it deal with the existence of states and state aggression?
I don't think there's really any commentary to be had yet.
No, I mean, he's just kind of setting up
yeah.
what he's about to talk about. But basically, he's talking about how in the private system where everybody's sort of individually insured, the insurance rates would have to be changing basically at a almost
far more variable. Yeah.
Right. They're definitely variable because, you have different people might move into a certain location and make it more crime infested, essentially, or something like that. Or the opposite might happen and a place might become safer. Or, the weather, the climate might change, and that might cause an area to be safer or less safe. So insurance rates would have to adjust based on all types of things. So he's going to talk about what would we do about that. Mm-hmm. In answering these questions, it is essential to recall some elementary economic insights. Other things being equal, private property owners generally and business owners in particular prefer locations with low protection costs, insurance premiums, and rising property values to those with high protection costs and falling property values. Consequently, there is a tendency toward the migration of people and goods from high risk and falling property value areas into low risk and increasing property value areas. Furthermore, protection costs and property values are directly related. Other things being equal, higher protection costs, greater attack risks imply lower or falling property values, and lower protection costs imply higher or increasing property values. These laws and tendencies shape the operation of a competitive system of insurance protection agencies.
All right, just explaining the nature of, essentially what you would want.
Well, right. So he's saying that, you're going to have basically higher and lower. You're going to have areas where property is essentially safer than in other areas. And in those areas where the property is safer, the property is worth more, but it's going to cost you less to protect that property because it's less likely to get damaged by something, and that people are going to tend to want to move to those areas. So the incentives all kind of line up that way, if that makes sense.
Yep.
All right. Whereas a tax-funded monopolist will manifest a tendency to raise the cost and price of protection, private profit loss insurance agencies strive to reduce the cost of protection and thus bring about falling prices. At the same time, insurance agencies are more interested than anyone else in rising property values because this implies not only that their own property holdings appreciate, but that there will also be more of other people's property for them to insure. In contrast, if the risk of aggression increases and property values fall, there is less value to be insured, while the cost of protection and price of insurance rises, implying poor business conditions for an insurer. Consequently, insurance companies would be under permanent economic pressure to promote the former favorable and avert the latter unfavorable condition. Yeah, so again, the incentives would also line up for the insurance companies. They would have a tendency to want to only protect the things that are easier to protect, right? Because why would they want to have to pay out more money? Because if they're trying to protect something that's going to be constantly damaged, they're going to constantly be, having to pay more, in damages, right? Which is not a situation they want, even though, of course, they would be charging more money for that shit. They don't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah, and they're also making the inverse point that a state's likely to raise prices and also reduce the protection as well. Essentially increase the price of protection and also increase, cause inflation, essentially. So.
Right, whereas in the private system, the opposite would happen. Yeah, and the insurance company, would tend to do what I just said and want to insure the safer areas, which actually have the lower insurance costs, but higher property value that is insured. Okay. This incentive structure has a fundamental impact on the operation of insurers. First, as for the seemingly easier case of the protection against common crime and criminals, a system of competitive insurers would lead to a dramatic change in current crime policy. To recognize the extent of this change, it is instructive to look first at the present and familiar statist crime policy. While it is in the interest of state agents to combat common private crime, if only so that there is more property left for them to tax, as tax-funded agents, they have little or no interest in being particularly effective at the task of preventing it, or, if it has occurred, at compensating its victims and apprehending and punishing the offenders. Moreover, under democratic conditions, insult will be added to injury for if everyone, aggressors as well as non-aggressors, and residents of high crime locations as well as those of low crime locations, can vote and be elected to government office, a systematic redistribution of property rights from non-aggressors to aggressors and the residents of low crime areas to those of high crime areas comes into effect, and crime will actually be promoted. Accordingly, crime and the demand for private security services of all kinds are currently at an all-time high. Even more scandalously, instead of compensating the victims for crimes it did not prevent, as it should have, the government forces victims to pay again as taxpayers for the costs of the apprehension, imprisonment, rehabilitation, and or entertainment of their aggressors. And rather than requiring higher protection prices in high crime locations and lower ones in low crime locations, as insurers would, the government does the exact opposite. It taxes more in low crime and high crime. It taxes more in low crime and high property value areas than in high crime and low property value ones. Or it even subsidizes the residents of the latter locations, the slums, at the expense of those of the former, eroding the social conditions unfavorable to crime while promoting those favorable to it. That is a meaty paragraph. That is
that's an interesting takeaway, because it's the idea of essentially the way the incentives are in place and the way that essentially resources are distributed. Essentially, this creates a misallocation. They were kind of making we covered this in a previous paragraph, the idea of, if you were someone who couldn't be insured, essentially you create this crime class. They essentially weren't able to receive insurance, or they kind of had to deal with it on their own. Whereas we have this inverse system where you're going to essentially increase the resources towards controlling property rights, or keeping that stuff on lock in areas where there's more people, and they're also likely going to be getting a worse product. So I mean, he framed it in a weird way by essentially saying a misallocation of property rights. I mean, that was a weird way to put it, but it was an interesting way to put it, which is kind of a point he made earlier, I think, in this chapter, and the idea that like this concept that we're even all entitled to these like uniform property rights. It's like yeah, we are in a sense, but it's kind of like what do you get? So it's kind of the reality of like what happens on the ground, and like this idea that you're not entitled to some uniform code of law, and it's also this idea that it's not even really law, because once you understand this is all private property and if these are all areas owned by people, these are just terms of being on this certain area. So this is why you erase this concept, and now you're looking at it differently. And so then you end up with this interesting way to look at it, as if this like, oh, we're misallocating property rights.
Right. But yeah, I mean, yeah, he's saying here that basically, as you were kind of pointing out, that in the democratic system, because the taxpayers are just forced to pay for kind of this uniform protection thing, that everybody's forced to pay for that same thing, even if whether or not they're in like a safer area or not, which what winds up happening is because they have to allocate more resources to the higher crime areas, and that's kind of what they want, because they want to keep justifying, well, we need more money here to protect these higher crime areas or whatever. It winds up taking all this taxpayer money that is basically being paid by the people that live in the safer areas, and it's all going towards those higher crime areas, and it actually kind of incentivizes more crime in a way, because it's like, well, why wouldn't I do that? And then he kind of talks about, why wouldn't I, just go to that area and commit that crime, basically. And he talks about how the justice system plays into it, where those people are also being taxed to pay for the justice system that prosecutes, like, essentially the person that actually committed the crime against them, right? They're having to pay taxes for that. Like somebody robbed your store or whatever.
Yeah, and you're having to pay for the defense, essentially, through taxation.
For their defense, for their, housing, essentially, in prison and whatever. It's all crazy shit. And, we're seeing that even more and more now, right? Like, we're seeing, like, all these, like, liberal judges and whatever essentially letting people off for certain crimes, like, almost completely. We're seeing like really, really low sentences for like serious crimes too. You know what I mean? Like not even just theft, but we're seeing it for like rape, especially if it's, being committed by people of a certain race that is, of one of the more protected cultural Marxist classes, if that makes sense. Good example of it is Carmelo Anthony, right? Although I think his trial hasn't happened yet, but he winds up getting all this money from this like GoFundMe. Basically winds up being like supported by the state in a massive way. He committed a murder, and he's basically able to take all this money and like live extremely comfortably. It's completely ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And it incentivizes more people to act that way. You can't have 100%. A society that way.
No, we live in a society. The operation of competitive insurers would present a striking contrast. For one, if an insurer could not prevent a crime, it would have to indemnify the victim. Thus, above all, insurers would want to be effective in crime prevention. If they still could not prevent it, they would want to be efficient in the detection, apprehension, and punishment of criminal offenders, because in finding and arresting an offender, the insurer could force the criminal rather than the victim and its insurer to pay for the damages and costs of indemnification. More specifically, just as insurance companies currently maintain and continually update a detailed local inventory of property values, so would they maintain and continually update a detailed local inventory of crimes and criminals. Other things being equal, the risk of aggression against any private property location increases with the proximity and the number and resources of potential aggressors. Thus, insurers would be interested in gathering information on actual crimes and known criminals and their locations, and it would be in their mutual interest of minimizing property damage to share this information with each other, just as banks now share information on bad credit risks with each other. Furthermore, insurers would also be particularly interested in gathering information on potential, not yet committed and known, crimes and aggressors, and this would lead to a fundamental overhaul and improvement in current status crime statistics. In order to predict the current incidence of crime and thus calculate its current price, insurers would correlate the frequency, description, and character of crimes and criminals with the social surroundings in which they occur and operate. And always under competitive pressure, they would develop and continually refine an elaborate system of demographic and sociological crime indicators. That is, every neighborhood would be described and its risk assessed in terms of a multitude of crime indicators such as the composition of its inhabited sexes, age groups, races, nationalities, ethnicities, religions, languages, professions, and incomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you're right. In the private insurance / defense system that he's talking about now, he is saying that the incentives would line up such that the insurance and defense companies would actually be incentivized to protect you against crime because they don't want to have to, pay out, obviously, because they would have to pay you for those damages in this case because everything is working as, actually incentivized, as a free market would intend. So he's saying they would actually, these insurance agencies would actually be incentivized to kind of work with each other and like maintain a list of, oh, this guy is a known criminal. This guy, has committed all this property damage or whatever. So we know that if this guy is in this location, well, that means we kind of have to charge more, for our insurance in this location or whatever. And we want to actually try to essentially prevent that from happening to him. Maybe that guy would be just like kind of barred from even living in certain areas, right? Just the disassociation would kind of just happen that way in this ideal private system. I think that's basically the whole point there. That was
and then they're trying to create the incentives for these large groups to work together, despite this idea that it'd be war, like all versus all, like or some nonsense. Mm-hmm. Consequently, and in distinct contrast to the present situation, all interlocal, regional, racial, national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic income and wealth redistribution would disappear, and a constant source of social conflict would be removed permanently. Instead, the reemerging price structure would tend to accurately reflect the risk of each location and its particular social surroundings, such that one would only be asked to pay for the insurance risk of himself and of that associated with his particular neighborhood. More importantly, based on its continually updated and refined system of statistics on crime and property values, and further motivated by the noted migration tendency from high risk, low value, henceforth bad, to low risk, high value, henceforth good locations, a system of competitive aggression insurers would promote a tendency towards civilizational progress.
Yeah. Oh no, he's talking about crime statistics and how they relate to ethnicity there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, basically, he kind of just reiterated the point that he already made earlier in this section there, basically. Yeah, like insurance companies are going to charge, lower amounts if you're in a safer neighborhood or whatever, safer location. So it's going to incentivize people to want to behave better and move into those areas instead, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Governments and democratic governments in particular erode good and promote bad neighborhoods through their tax and transfer policy. They do so also with possibly an even more damaging effect through their policy of forced integration. This policy has two aspects. On the one hand, for the owners and residents in good locations and neighborhoods who are forced with an immigration problem, forced integration means that they must accept, without discrimination, every domestic immigrant as transient or tourist on public roads, as customer, client, resident, or neighbor. They are prohibited by their government from excluding anyone, including anyone they consider an undesirable potential risk from an immigration. On the other hand, for the owners and residents in bad locations and neighborhoods who experience emigration rather than immigration, forced integration means that they are prevented from effective self-protection. Rather than being allowed to rid themselves of crime through the expulsion of known criminals from their neighborhood, they are forced by their government to live in permanent association with their aggressors. Obviously, the simple point of that paragraph is, the freedom of association. If you're not able to dissociate, then you can end up with some bad apples that you're forced to associate with.
It's a great paragraph there, actually, because of course that's something that we're seeing constantly now, right, with the immigration issue and whatever, and why open immigration is actually bad. I mean, he's describing that right there, where it's basically, well, if you want to maintain this area, this neighborhood, whatever, this location where you have people that are known as being, non-aggressors, whatever, you have a safe location. In a private society, it would be a place where you'd have low insurance costs, whatever. You can't have that here because you can't practice freedom of disassociation, like you just said. So in this case, you're forced to integrate with people who might be criminals and might be aggressors, and that's going to cause, all that chaos to happen there. You're going to have a whole location where you can't actually have it be safe anymore, and it would be a situation where you just can't even maintain it anymore. You're going to have property damage, going up and whatever, and you can't do anything about it because the incentives are all fucked up.
100%. The results of a system of private protection insurers would be in striking contrast to these only all too familiar decivilizing effects and tendencies of status crime protection. To be sure, insurers would be unable to eliminate the differences between good and bad neighborhoods. In fact, these differences might even become more pronounced. However, driven by their interest in rising property values and falling protection costs, insurers would promote a tendency to improve by uplifting and cultivating both good and bad neighborhoods. Thus, in good neighborhoods, insurers would adopt a policy of selective immigration. Unlike states, they could and would not want to disregard the discriminating inclinations among the insured toward immigrants. To the contrary, even more so than any one of their clients, insurers would be interested in discrimination, i.e. in admitting only those immigrants whose presence adds to lower crime risk and increased property values, and excluding those whose presence lead to a higher risk and lower property values. That is, rather than eliminating discrimination, insurers would rationalize and perfect its practice. Based on their statistics on crime and property values, and in order to reduce the cost of protection and raise property values, insurers would formulate and continually refine various restrictive, exclusionary rules and procedures relating to immigration and immigrants, and thus give quantitative precision in the form of prices and price differences to the value of discrimination and the cost of non-discrimination between potential immigrants as high or low risk and value productive. One last paragraph on that. And similarly, in bad neighborhoods, the interests of the insurers and the insured would coincide. Insurers would not want to suppress the expulsionist inclinations among the insured toward known criminals. This would rationalize such tendencies by offering selective price cuts contingent on specific cleanup operations. Indeed, in cooperation with one another, insurers would want to expel known criminals not just from their immediate neighborhood, but from civilization altogether into a wilderness or open frontier in the Amazon jungle, the Sahara, or the polar regions. But no, it's I do like that the point that he's driving at there at the end is essentially how even under this system, like, well, what about the uninsured? Like, well, even then it's incentivized to make this system better, even for the uninsured, just simply by being in the vicinity of the insured.
Yeah, I mean, I love those like last few paragraphs there. And in that last section that you just read, he's talking about how in a private society, he's basically slamming like libertarian open immigration proponents right there with that last paragraph or two right there, basically by saying, well, if you're in a private property society with this private insurance setup and whatever, you're not going to have anything that looks like open immigration here. Like, I'm sorry. Like, the incentive is going to be to keep your area safe, keep it, low protection costs, low insurance costs, whatever. What that means is that you're only going to let in people that are going to be conducive to that type of environment. You're not going to let in, right, you're not going to let in criminals and stuff. And in fact, known criminals, you're not going to let them in. You're going to exclude them. And like, yeah, he's saying.
And you're going to let everyone else know about them too.
Yeah, you're throwing them out to the Badlands, basically. So like, yeah, the Wild West, the not so Wild West, that was kind of happening, right? Like the outlaws wound up, in like whatever, like Deadwood and whatever. They want about in like the Badlands of South Dakota because it's like, well, you're excluded from, peaceful society now, so go over there and just have your your Wild West shit over there, basically. I don't know if that's a great example, but it's, in my mind, it sounds like it is.
All right, on to part 9, buddy.
Let's do it. What about defense against a state? How would insurers protect us from state aggression? First off, it is essential to remember that governments as compulsory tax-funded monopolies are inherently wasteful and inefficient in whatever they do. This is also true for weapons technology and production, and military intelligence and strategy, especially in our age of high technology. Accordingly, states would not be able to compete within the same territory against voluntarily financed insurance agencies. Moreover, most important and general among the restrictive rules relating to immigration and designed by insurers to lower protection costs and increase property values would be a rule concerning government agents. States are inherently aggressive and pose a permanent danger to every insurer and insured. Thus, insurers in particular would want to exclude or severely restrict as a potential security risk the immigration, territorial entry of all known government agents, and they would induce the insured either as a condition of insurance or of a lower premium to exclude or strictly limit any direct contact with any known government agent, be it as a visitor, customer, client, resident, or neighbor. That is, wherever insurance companies operated in all free territories, state agents would be treated as undesirable outcasts, potentially more dangerous than any common criminal. Accordingly, states and their personnel would be able to operate and reside only in territorial separation from and on the fringes of free territories. Furthermore, owing to the comparatively lower economic productivity of statist territories, governments would be continually weakened by the emigration of their most value-productive residents.
All right, just making fun of government agents. That's about all that paragraph is. Yeah.
I mean, I kind of loved it, though.
Well, I love it. It's great.
Yeah,
they are inherently violent actors. They are
right.
Pushing for a systematic, system of coercion.
Yeah, well, he's answering the, what if the warlords take over question, which is sort of, the answer to that is really, they've taken over now.
Well, then kill them.
Right, so you should try something else. But he's saying that, if you have this free territory here and it's, private, whatever, you have private defense, private insurance, that private defense is actually going to work to defend that territory, not just against criminals that are trying to enter your territory, whether they be immigrants or whatever, but government agents from other states would actually be treated that way too.
He's literally advocating a system of bullying for government agents. Pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, you get completely excluded. You get kicked out, bro. You're not coming in here.
And if we do, it's going to be at some sort of crazy price.
Right, and because your economy would be better, at least in this ideal situation, he's saying that people would actually be migrating. We've seen something like this happen before, obviously, but he's saying that people would want to be migrating out of those more statist areas into less statist areas, which, the best example of that is the Berlin Wall, right? The Berlin Wall was to keep people in the communist side of it, not out of the, freer side of it. You know what I mean? So that is, one example of something like that, at least.
Mm-hmm. All right. Alrighty. Let's get to the next part.
Now, what if such a government should decide to attack or invade a free territory? This would be easier said than done. Who and what would it attack? There would be no state opponent. Only private property owners and their private insurance agencies would exist. No one, least of all the insurers, would have presumably engaged in aggression or even provocation. If there were any aggression or provocation against the state at all, this would be the action of a particular person, and in this case, the interest of the state and insurance agencies would fully coincide. Both would want to see the attacker punished and held accountable for damages. But without any aggressor enemy, how could the state justify an attack, not to mention an indiscriminate attack? And surely it would have to justify it, for the power of every government, even the most despotic one, ultimately rests on opinion and consent, as La Boétie, Hume, Mises, and Rothbard have explained. Kings and presidents can issue can issue an order to attack, of course, but there must be scores of men willing to execute their order to put it into effect. There must be generals receiving and following the order, soldiers willing to march, kill, and be killed, and domestic producers willing to continue producing to fund the war. If this consensual willingness were absent because the orders of the state rulers were considered illegitimate, even the seemingly most powerful government would be rendered ineffectual and collapse, as the recent examples of the Shah of Iran and the Soviet Union have illustrated. Hence, from the viewpoint of the leaders of the state, an attack on free territories would be considered extremely risky. No propaganda effort, however elaborate, would make the public believe that its attack was anything but an aggression against innocent victims. In this situation, the rulers of the state would be happy to maintain monopolistic control over their present territory rather than run the risk of losing legitimacy and all of their power in an attempt at territorial expansion. Excuse me.
They're saying in this situation, the powerful may sometimes just not rock the boat instead of risking losing their legitimacy by protesting a little bit too much, essentially.
Right. Well, he's basically, first he's kind of saying, well, who would a state even be attacking in a free territory? Like, doesn't really make any sense.
Yes.
Like, because that state is at least not being provoked.
It's just going to be slaughtering innocents,
right,
or small groups of savages or some shit.
Right. So if they're doing that, they're going to be seen as illegitimate. Like, that war is going to be seen as illegitimate because it's not against the state. It's against people who are obviously people. So like there are going to be less people on the state's side, like where the state is, like in that country, there are going to be less people willing to actually do that state's bidding, right? Because it's more obvious that, well, we're just killing a bunch of innocent people here. So he's making that point. And he also made the point that if there was really any provocation at all, it would probably come from an individual from the free area into that state. And in that case, the incentives all actually line up. Like, the free area would actually be like, okay, this guy's a criminal. We don't fucking want him here anyway. Like, he killed somebody in your state or whatever. Okay, well, you can have him. We will, what's the word I'm looking for there? When you, when you send somebody, like, over to a country where they committed that crime. Why am I...
Deport them? Deport?
No. I can't think of my... Extradite.
Yeah, there you go. That's the word.
I can't think of words anymore, man.
Yeah, I couldn't think of it either. Yeah.
Brain damage, yeah.
Tired today.
Right, so it would be like a sort of extradition, basically, in that case.
Yeah. All right, as unlikely as this may be, what if a state still attacked and/or invaded a neighboring free territory? In this case, the aggressor would not encounter an unarmed population. Only in status territories is the civilian population characteristically unarmed. States everywhere aim to disarm their own citizenry so as to better be able to tax and expropriate it. In contrast, insurers in free territories would not want to disarm the insured, nor could they. For who would want to be protected by someone who required him as a first step to give up his ultimate means of self-defense? To the contrary, insurance agencies would encourage the ownership of weapons among their insured by means of selective price cuts. So, point being is you might even literally see essentially economic incentives to have more weaponry to quite a ridiculous degree because it benefits your insurance company because they go, hey, you'll be able to protect our investment. So
right, because it's like, yeah, we're investing in you. We're going to protect your property. Like, yeah, so why would so that insurance company obviously would be fine with that property owner defending their own property with guns as well, because it's like, well, if they're doing that, then I'm even less likely to have to pay property damage for this guy, right? Because he's defending his property too. So they'd actually be incentivized to have weapons in that case. And of course, he's saying that, in the opposite case, in the democratic state, the state is going to want to take away your guns because then you can't defend, yourself against taxation and whatever else might be happening, against whatever property seizure the state wants to, commit against you.
Yeah.
And he is also saying that because all the incentives line up this way, such that the population would be armed in the free state, that that's a disincentive for a state to actually come in and try to attack that territory because it knows these citizens are armed. So it's like, oh, fuck. We're going to be attacking
not only are you going to be slaughtering what is very obviously, individual private actors, thus very much destroying your credibility because you're just murdering people, you're also going to be encountering probably armed people. And let's keep going on with that thread of thought. In addition to the opposition of an armed private citizenry, the aggressor state would run into the resistance of not only one, but in all likelihood several insurance and reinsurance agencies. In the case of a successful attack and invasion, the insurers would be faced with massive indemnification payments. Unlike the aggressing state, however, these insurers would be efficient and competitive firms. Other things being equal, the risk of an attack and hence the price of defense insurance would be higher in locations in close proximity to state territories than in places far away from any state. To justify this higher price, insurers would have to demonstrate defensive readiness vis-a-vis any possible state aggression to their clients and in the form of intelligence services, the ownership of suitable weapons and materials, and military personnel and training. In other words, the insurers would be effectively equipped and trained for the contingency of a state attack and ready to respond with a twofold defense strategy. On the one hand, insofar as their operations in free country or territories are concerned, insurers would be ready to expel, capture, or kill every invader while trying to avoid or minimize all collateral damage. On the other hand, insofar as their operations on state territory are concerned, insurers would be prepared to target the aggressor, the state, for retaliation. That is, insurers would be ready to counterattack and kill. Whether with long-range precision weapons or assassination commandos, state agents from the top of the government hierarchy of king, president, or prime minister on downward, while seeking to avoid or minimize all collateral damage to the property of innocent civilians, non-state agents, they would thereby encourage internal resistance against the aggressive government, promote its delegitimization, and possibly incite the liberation and transformation of the state territory into a free country.
Hoppe was just Fed posting right there.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's making the point that, not only is a state, if they attack this free area, not only are they going to be going up against an armed populace, but they're also going to be going up against armed insurance agencies, protection agencies, whatever, that probably have even better arms.
Yeah, and multiple of them that are going to work in concert together. Yeah.
Right. So, they're going to be working to defend against, that state attack. So that's going to disincentivize that state from attacking at all. And if they do, they may very well lose, of course. So, yeah. Which, we've seen that even with, the U.S. and whatever, in Vietnam. There's a reason why the U.S. lost in Vietnam, right? They were entering a foreign territory. They didn't really know, the land very well, and they were fighting against an armed populace there that knew the land a lot better.
Yeah. Good luck. Welcome to the Punji jungle.
Right.
All right. I have come full circle with my argument. First, I have shown that the idea of a protective state and state protection of private property is based on a fundamental theoretical error, and this error has had disastrous consequences: the destruction and insecurity of all private property in perpetual war. Second, I have shown that the correct answer to the question of who is to defend private property owners from aggression is the same as for the production of every other good or service: private property owners, cooperation based on division of labor, and market competition. Third, I have explained how a system of private profit loss insurers would effectively minimize aggression, whether by private criminals or states, and promote a tendency towards civilization and perpetual peace. The only task outstanding is to implement these insights, to withdraw one's consent and willing cooperation from the state, and to promote its delegitimization in public opinion so as to persuade others to do the same. Without the erroneous public perception and judgment of the state as just and necessary, and without the public's voluntary cooperation, even the seemingly most powerful government would implode and its powers evaporate. Thus liberated, we would regain our right to self-defense and be able to turn to freed and unregulated insurance agencies for efficient professional assistance in all matters of protection and conflict resolution. And that is the end of Chapter 12, which brings us to Chapter 13, the final chapter on the impossibility of limited government and the prospect for revolution. So it looks like we're going to end this book off mega based. So hell yeah. So any thoughts on the end there, bud?
He was just wrapping up what he'd already said in that chapter, although the last thing that he said, that's kind of the hardest part. He's basically like, well, I proved my point, about private protection, and private protection, I think he kind of saved it for basically last in the book, because that's the last hurdle that people tend to have to get over, right, to reach this, conclusion in their mind that the state is totally illegitimate. If you want to go autistic anarchist here. So he leaves that for last, and he's saying, well, I've proved this too. Like like you believe in free markets for all these other sectors. Well, here's why it also makes sense for defense and protection and whatever. Here you go. And now what's the last thing to do is to get people on board with that. But I think that's the hardest part. I mean, I don't see that even happening. I don't think you're going to be able to get people on board with that, man. They just can't grasp that.
Well, time will tell, buddy. With that, let people know where they can find you at. We'll go ahead and get out of here. We'll do another one of these soon, and we'll get finished with this book in short order.
Yeah, Learn to Toad on Twitter. Learn to Toad is my Instagram as well, where I do betting content that's related to my betting show, Better Off Dead, BETTOR, which is on YouTube and all the audio platforms. And I also have a ukulele project, Covered in Uke, which is on YouTube. And I do put some ukulele stuff out on a Patreon Spotify feed as well. I have a Patreon at patreon.com/learntotode. And at the higher levels, you get that Spotify feed with audio of the ukulele covers that I'm putting out. And the highest level is prioritized ukulele requests as well. So check it out.
Hell yeah, brother. Well, for those who want to support what I'm doing over here, if you don't want to chip any money, if you can't, I get it. It's a tough world. Leave a like, share, subscribe, comment, leave a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify. You can also follow me on Twitter at Tower Gang Jose. Those are all little actions you can take that cost you nothing and help boost the show. But if you do want to help the show in the best way you really can, the best way to do that's with money over at patreon.com/NoWayJose2020. The lowest level is $2, and you get quite the value from that, I believe. I do put 1 to 2 paywalled episodes out a week. I keep about 4 or so behind the paywall at any given time, so it's usually weeks of paywalled content. You also get an ad-free RSS feed. You get access to the Telegram. You get access to the pre-show and priority for the call-ins on me and Austin's weekly live call-in show, which is on Tuesdays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. On the highest level, that's the sponsors, and I give them a big shout out every episode. I have the guests of the show today, former co-host in Tower Gang at Learn to Toad, also at Abrogate D's at ZOVRECK at _Infant Zeal, Tim Tuttle at John Klebold, Will Bells, Delicious Blueberry Rabbit Eye Wine, big fan of the show, Torn May at Wayne Taculus, and Not Masad. With that, guys, we are out of here. Love you all. We will see you again soon. Bye bye.
Peace.
Ooh.